From KVUE News in Austin, you're watching Texas This Week with Ashley Goodo.
Jeremy, thank you so much for being with us.
No, absolutely glad to be here.
You know, this week, the Houston Chronicle broke a really big story about a letter from a DPS trooper stationed at the border with Operation Lone Star to his supervisors. Tell us what was in this email.
Yeah, this is a medic with the DPS, an officer with them, who was concerned about some of the tactics that he was seeing used at the border to repel migrants from the shoreline. He says in his letter that, DPS officers were pushing people back into the water, including, children and, pregnant women, and pushing them away from the shore. Now, the question is, was it physically putting hands on people to push them into the water and get them away from the shore? Or, as DPS has tried to correct and say, look, no, we're just putting barriers here to make people push away from the shore. We're not telling officers to do that. But that's caused them to have to now, open their own investigation to make sure their DPS, officers and the National Guard troops that are there aren't overstepping the line and aren't misinterpreting what they want to get done down there.
The other thing in this email, there's a lot of examples of, really harrowing,
yes,
I would go as far as to say inhumane treatment of people. Tell us about some of the most egregious things that he pointed out that he has seen.
Yeah, to actually see migrants injured, to get caught into the razor wire. Now, this razor wire is not like your typical barbed wire. This is like sharp, bloody, incidents that are happening from that. So he's found people wrapped in the wire. And again, this feeds into what we already heard from Federal Border Patrol just a week earlier. We reported that the Border Patrol in Eagle Pass was complaining that they're having trouble getting to the migrants when the migrants are hurt, just like this officer's saying. It's like, so they're having to cut through the DPS razor wire at their risk of getting hurt to go get these people who then they can get care and aid to. And so you see it's happening on two fronts at this point. We have the Federal Border Patrol saying it, and now we have a DPS officer saying he can't get to the migrants himself. It's like he's seeing the injuries. He's seeing the children who are actually getting hurt and the dehydration of people that they can't get to. And so it's really terrible stuff.
I think probably one of the most just things that really stuck with me in reading the email was about the woman having a miscarriage.
Yeah. And not being able to get to her. Again, you understand why they want migrants not to cross at that point. They want to push them to the ports of entry. They want to push them back across the river and use the appropriate ways. I get that. But in this case, what's happening is that you're seeing people getting hurt, and the people who could render aid to them are having trouble getting there. It's like a pregnant woman, a woman, having a miscarriage, and it's on our soil. It's basically right there. And we're instructing both Federal Border Patrol and now maybe DPS officers not to give aid. That's what this officer was saying, that he was not being able to give aid to these people. And that just, you can imagine a lot of people having trouble with that. This can't be just him. This can't be just one officer. It can't be one Border Patrol officer. This is a lot of people who are like, okay, look, we understand the goal, but have we gone too far?
Right. There's also a claim about a 4-year-old girl not being able to give her water.
Yeah.
And then what happens to her, according to him?
Yeah, without water, you can imagine. It's 116 degrees along that area of the border. You think it's hot in central Texas. You go down into Eagle Pass, that place is cooking. It's like when I've been down there, it just feels like, the sand's blowing off like the desert and just hitting you in the face all the time down there. And so you have this dehydrated little girl who needs water, and we can't get water to her. And DPS is saying, no, we're not telling people to do that. And maybe there's some misunderstanding here. And one of the things I talked to with some DPS, superiors who this man wrote the email to, they said, no, we're not saying you can't give these people water. We're not saying that. But yet somehow that's what this trooper interpreted as. He could not give this child water. It's like, how is that possible?
Yeah. You, as you mentioned, have been to Eagle Pass numerous times, and you and I were talking in terms of how it's set up, how it physically looks. People don't always see this razor wire that's there.
Yeah.
It's not a clear cut, sort of barrier. Explain to us, describe for us what it looks like.
Yeah, a lot of, so this razor wire is not like barbed wire. Barbed wire you'll see like, on a fence or whatever, you can see at the top. The razor wire has this coiling effect to it. And so it becomes like this, part of it is in the water at times, not all the time. Some parts are all on shore, but some of it, is in the water, and the river fluctuates in its height. So it comes up sometimes and covers wire that maybe the DPS and National Guard didn't expect to be in the water, but the water levels will rise and fall on the Rio Grande. And so what's happening is like some of that water is covering the razor wire, so the migrants can't see it. So as they're being pushed away from one entry point that they think is there, they start walking down the river. Because some parts of it's shallow enough, and then it gets deeper, then it gets shallow. It's like, and so it's this, puzzle all the way down there, and now they have this added barrier of razor wire underneath, which is clearly, cut some people up. We know that now. We know, from this account that we've seen from the email. I've talked to Border Patrol. Border Patrol's had the same problem. There are people getting cut up, and they're trying to get to them, and they're being delayed getting there because DPS has been instructed not to work with Border Patrol in some areas. One section of the river that I was in, where they were putting in those floating buoy barriers, we watched as Border Patrol had been fenced away from the river. Border Patrol, they created a spot for caring for migrants, so they had water, shade, toilets, and things like that for the migrants when they come across. But DPS has shut it down by putting barriers and razor wire all in front of it, so the migrants can't get there. And so the Border Patrol is on the other side of this fence with all this potential aid to help the very people they see struggling walking along the river who are clearly dehydrated, and they can't get to them because DPS has ordered no. The DPS tells me, no, the Border Patrol station was becoming a magnet for these migrants, so they would go towards it for aid. Well, of course they are, of course. And it's like, and they don't want that to happen. And so they're trying to say, no, we're going to shut that down so the migrants will go back across the river and go home.
But when you talk about people coming in areas that are not ports of entry, again, these are people who are going to go to these areas and then surrender themselves to border security. I mean, these are not the people who want to come into the country and then not go through the process. These are people who are coming to surrender themselves.
Yep.
And now the state is making it harder, if I understand this correctly, for folks to surrender themselves.
Yeah, federal law allows a person to come onto U.S. soil to claim asylum out of some fear of danger or some imminent fear of danger that they see back in their home territory or what need be. So we have that, in the books now that's supposed to happen. So that's what a lot of migrants are doing. It's like they want to get to Eagle Pass just to surrender themselves. But that's what the state wants to stop. The state doesn't want that to happen. They've complained. We've heard the governor, call, the Border Patrol paperwork. Shufflers, where, all they want to do is process these migrants and send them on their way. He wants to repel them from the border. You can see the conflict that's starting to happen here, where now these migrants who are making it across the river, they're technically allowed to have Border Patrol take them in and take their claim and let Border Patrol handle it. But DPS doesn't want that to happen. They want to push them away. So it's going to be, at some point, there's going to be a conflict here in terms of like, okay, who has authority over these people as they get in there? And you're seeing it work out in real time where like Border Patrol has a really tough, difficult job down there. And it's just got a lot harder. And it's because of Texas DPS putting barriers in their way.
And I think it's important to note, I don't think anyone argues that unlawful immigration in this country is an issue. I think everyone can agree with that. But when we talk about pushing people away, they're not going to go back to the countries from which they just came.
Yep. Well, and that's a really important point, particularly in this region of the state. Look, the border is a really long stretch, and people kind of conflate all of it into one thing. I try to tell people it's like comparing Boston to Jacksonville, Florida. It's that much distance on the Rio Grande River. You're talking about vast stretches that are very different from one section to the next. This part of Eagle Pass used to be one of the least crossed border areas in the state. For most of my lifetime, it was always the least crossed areas. People preferred going through the Rio Grande Valley or other parts out in California, but this was usually the least crossed. It's now the most crossed. It's like the influx of people, though, has been mostly Venezuelan, Haitian, Nicaraguans, people fleeing dictatorships or massive poverty. Lots of Haitians came through there last year, we saw. And so we have 4 nations particularly where migrants are being told to go to this section because Piedras Negras is considered a little bit safer than some of the other cities in Mexico, according to some of the migrants. And so what they're doing, this is a new flux coming through there. It startled people in Eagle Pass. They want to see some security to stop that flow. For good reason, right? You don't want people just trespassing on your land and getting hurt. And so they've asked for this. But what I'm hearing from landowners now, I spoke to a couple who were like, yeah, we want something there, but this has gone too far. We've turned this into a military zone. What's happened is like the river used to be this lush green area. They've cut all of that down. It's now a dirt road completely, with the razor wire, with the buoy barrier in the middle, with military vehicles on it. So it looks like almost like a river in like Iraq, like when the US government was fighting the war there, right? So here we are instead, in Eagle Pass, Texas, a place that isn't used to this, now looking like somewhat of a military zone.
Wow. What are we hearing from the state about all of this, particularly about the investigation and investigating these claims from the email?
Yeah, they've made the case that this is a misunderstanding and misinterpretation. And so one of the things that was explained to me by one DPS official who I can't name right now, but they told me that they think there's so many troops coming in and out. They're on a rotation, so it's not the same DPS troopers there every day, day in and day out. They've moved people in and out constantly, and so what they're concerned about is that maybe with all that turnover that's happening there, people are misinterpreting orders and not hearing things the same way that they should. And so they're saying, look, yes, we have told people to push migrants back, but we don't mean physically with hands. We mean physically in terms of putting a barrier there so people will go somewhere else. That's what we mean. We don't mean to actually push migrant, women and children into the water. Of course, we now getting reports that may be misinterpreted and being done. And so now we have this situation of where DPS has to try to figure out, well, what went wrong here? Is there something that's happening? And they haven't said that's happening. They haven't backed up the trooper yet to say that this is, we physically know this is happening. They're looking at the claims to see if it's happening. So we still don't have confirmation yet from the state that, this is in fact happening. They're just saying we need to look into it to make sure it's not.
There are lawmakers on the federal level calling for the Biden administration to step in and to take action against Texas. Tell us about that.
Oh yeah, and it's getting more and more so. It's like, expect over the next couple of days, members of Congress are really going to start putting a lot of pressure on the Biden administration to do more right now. All we've had so far from the Biden administration is, the Justice Department has said they're looking into the matter. The, State Department has said they've asked for information from the state on the barriers that they're placing in and around the water, but we don't have anything really definitive yet. Even the White House, the press secretary for the White House came out and said that this is terrible. We abhor what's happening, but there's been no actual action yet in terms of what the federal government can and can't do. And what we're seeing is a lot of Democrats in Congress, particularly, from Texas, Joaquin Castro, particularly congressman from San Antonio, has said he wants the Biden administration to be doing more.
Mm-hmm. And then there's Mexico, who's also not happy with this water barrier that Texas has put in.
Yeah, I've been reporting on this treaty that we have with Mexico dating back to 1970 that dictates that if we put anything in the water, anything, that we have to get sign off from both the federal and state governments. Or federal and Mexican governments. That hasn't happened here. The authority that watches over that has asked Texas for information, has so far received nothing. The state is essentially ignoring that. And so Mexico has now put in an official diplomatic note to the State Department to get clarification on what's happening. But of course, we know the State Department doesn't have any information either. You know, they are trying to get the same information that the Mexican authorities are asking for. So it's really kind of creating a conflict that I kind of wonder if politically this is exactly what Governor Abbott would like to have happen, where he has this conflict with the Biden administration over the border. He's clearly got their attention at this point. They're talking about Eagle Pass. And so now, where do we go from here? And how do we resolve this without, you know, violating this treaty? This treaty is really important. Like, again, the river is a long river. It provides drinking water. It provides natural habitat for, you know, plants and wildlife. It's irrigation for farms on both sides of the river. And so when we start messing with the flow of the river and the access to the river, that is when Mexico and the federal government go, wait a minute, we can't do this. This affects more than just the people of Eagle Pass at this point. This affects, you know, millions of people who live on either side of the river.
Yeah. To your point, if nothing else, Governor Abbott wants the Biden administration to take some sort of action, and we're just going to have to wait and see how it all plays out politically.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this is the showdown I think we all knew was eventually going to come, and I think we are right on top of it at this point.
Jeremy, we thank you for taking some time to talk with us.
No, I appreciate it. Thank you for having me on.